1990. The Kenya Patriotic Front was in the last stages of executing a coup. The coup was to dethrone MOI. The leader of the guerrilla movement was one KOIGI WAWAMWERE. But KOIGI was not in Kenya. He had been on the run for the past 4 years. KOIGI first fled Kenya for Uganda on 10 July 1986. While in Uganda, KOIGI had two motives. One, to seek asylum in Norway, where his family would be safe from the persecutions of President Moi. And two, to learn from Museveni and the National Resistance Army of Uganda on how to successfully carry out a revolution. KOIGI was an ardent admirer of Museveni and the Ugandan people, particularly of how, in 1981, Comrade Yoweri Museveni, with a small army that had only 27 guns, started a war at Kabamba. The citizens joined, and eventually, a revolution that couldn't be stopped. While in Kampala, September 1986, KOIGI met Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya and Captain Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso. He viewed these two, together with Comrade Museveni, as revolutionary heroes of the time. KOIGI would then fly his family to Norway for political asylum. He then returned to Libya to train for guerrilla warfare. With a good word from Museveni, KOIGI was welcomed in Libya by Colonel Gaddafi. Gaddafi had helped Museveni during his days in the bush with the NRA. KOIGI recruited lieutenants from Kenya who flew to Libya via Uganda. In Kenya, members of the Kenya Patriotic Front recruited members secretly. The KPF leadership sourced funds from businessmen. Some KPF members were prominent politicians within KANU and were sources of intelligence for the organization. The organization also had an underground publication, MOI Kenya. It was secretly distributing leaflets with the revolution message to the masses. KOIGI and his army learned how to magnify the impact of a small force and make it a large national movement. They learned how to gather intelligence, how to kidnap opponents, how to cause skirmishes, and the act of espionage. Gaddafi donated weapons, radios, and uniforms. Sankara provided money. Museveni provided mercenaries. In September 1990, KOIGI returned to Uganda, ready to make his entry into Kenya and start the revolution. The weapons and uniforms were hidden in a refrigerated fish truck and transported to Nairobi. Nairobi was the operational headquarters of the Kenya Patriotic Front. KOIGI and his lieutenants then planned to travel separately to Nairobi via Kampala to avoid detection. For this case, KOIGI dressed like a Muslim lady. He covered his head with a black hijab and wore big dark glasses. He boarded an ordinary bus and started the long ride to Nairobi. The only doubts playing in his mind were the revolution, the second Mau Mau uprising, the end of Moi, the liberation of Kenya by Kenyans. But by the time he got to Nairobi, he had been betrayed. At 2 a.m., police broke into the house KOIGI and his comrades had checked into. It was in Kariobangi South. KOIGI was startled. He tried to escape. He ran through the backyard door, climbed through the compound wall and landed in another compound. But the police were already there. Surrounded, he surrendered. The police recovered an assortment of 10 Russian AK-47s, 10 Chinese hand grenades, and several pistols. The police who arrested KOIGI quickly bound his hands and feet with ropes and closed his mouth with an adhesive tape laced with powerful chemicals. Unconscious, he was handed over to the intelligence unit at their headquarters, Nyayo House. When he woke up, he was drowsy and his head heavy with sedation. After a while, he realized that he was in a dark isolation cell. It smelled foul and had crusts on the floor. Crusts from dead cockroaches and dry human excreta. Above his cell, there was a powerful fan that blew both hot and cold air alternatively. When it blew cold air, the cell felt like a freezer. KOIGI shivered. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. His toes and fingers started to darken with frostbite. When it was blowing hot, the cell felt like one standing in the middle of a Sahara desert at noon. KOIGI would sweat until his body was dehydrated. There was also a pipe that let in cold water at night. The cold water rose to his ankles. When he couldn't stand anymore, he sat in the water, all the while naked and his hands tied to his back. This was a long nightmare happening to KOIGI. This was the Nyayo torture chambers. When his eyes started to adapt to the dark, he saw a white panic button on the wall across. He struggled to stand. He walked slowly, hoping that someone would respond to his panic call. He pressed the white button with his chin. He heard a buzzer ring in a distant room. He pressed again and waited 30 minutes. No one came. He pressed again and waited an hour. No one came. It was then that he realized that this was designed for psychological torture. After what seemed like eternity, the cell's doors finally creaked open. 8 men entered the cell. One man brought in a chair and roughly pulled KOIGI to sit on it. KOIGI noticed that 5 of the men were dressed in suits, while 3 were in full military gear and were pointing their guns at him. Then the leader, smiling triumphantly for having captured a guerrilla leader, shone a light on KOIGI's face and started talking to him. Confess that the above story is true and you might see another day, the man shouted to KOIGI. Confess that you are planning to start a guerrilla war and the president might pardon you. Confess that you had met with Museveni, Gaddafi, and Sankara so that you can see the end to this. The balding man was referring to the above story that the captors had fabricated on KOIGI WAWAMWERE. I will now give you my hand. If you shake it, it will mean that you have agreed to join us and we will make peace here and now. The man said to KOIGI, "Here, take my hand." "No, I will not take it." KOIGI mustered a little strength and, with a voice filled with defiance, refused to confess to the false allegations. "Lock him up to rot." The chair was roughly removed from under him, causing him to fall flat on his naked ass, hitting the water and the cement in his cell. He heard the metal doors clanging shut, and the key turning to lock him in, he was suddenly in the dark again. But to understand this point, I must take you back in time to 1979. In 1978, Moi rose from his role as the vice president to become the second president of Kenya. Having been a close student of Kenyatta, Moi's acceptance speech could be summarized in 2 words: fuata nyayo, follow the footsteps of Kenyatta. To commemorate the elevation, Moi wanted a monument that would solidify his Nyayo philosophy. So in 1979, he laid the first stone on a new building in Nairobi, a building that would be a landmark and a statement that this was the Nyayo era. So the construction of Nyayo House started at the intersection of Kenyatta Avenue and Uhuru Highway. 1979 was also an election year in Kenya. There was only one party then, KANU, and all elections were for parliamentary seats. The president's seat had no opposition. It was in that election that KOIGI got elected as the MP for Nakuru North. Moi was also elected as the MP for Baringo Central. Now, a little history. Although Moi was MP for Baringo Central, he had another home and where his political headquarters were, the home at Kabarak, Nakuru. Kabarak is in present-day Rongai constituency. But before Rongai constituency was formed in 1988, it was part of the Nakuru North constituency. I don't know if you are seeing where this is going. Moi's home was in Nakuru North. KOIGI was not the MP for Nakuru North, and therefore KOIGI was Moi's Member of Parliament. However, this didn't seem like an issue at that moment. KOIGI now felt that he had a better platform as an MP than when he was just a journalist. He wanted to take agitation higher. He was a backbencher in Parliament, but a loud backbencher. The first motion that KOIGI brought up was a motion against the shoot to kill directive by Jonjo, the Attorney General, in March 1980. His other landmark motions were one, to ban the use of Depo-Provera in Kenya. It was a family planning drug, but Kenyan scholars had studied it and discovered it had dangerous side effects on Kenyan women. Another motion sought to abolish the system where casual workers in big farms were paid on work completed, but not on days worked. In such farms, the daily work quota was so large that it would take days to complete. Some workers had to bring their children after school to help them complete their quota. But this motion was defeated. But it was what he did outside of Parliament that would make Moi's advisors notice him more. In 1980, KOIGI delivered a Swahili lecture on Marxism. He elaborated to a full auditorium the ideal nature of a socialist state. He explained to the eager students how in Kenyan society, Moi and his government were the oppressors and the people were the oppressed. KOIGI explained that in the end, the oppressed are eventually bound to revolt and build a new society and a new economy. Among the students in the auditorium that day was a first year in the School of Architecture, one Titus Ndugosi. Remember that name and that face. KOIGI followed up his lecture by drafting another law that was viewed as being communist in nature. In April 1980, KOIGI drafted a motion asking the government to reduce the price of land to 500 shillings per acre. This was supposed to bring equality to peasants and force landowners to part with their land at 500 shillings per acre. The motion was defeated. In the years that followed, Ndugosi became an admirer for KOIGI. The freedom spirit was burning in him, and in 1982, as a third-year student, Ndugosi succeeded in pressurizing the government in the re-registration of SONU, Student Organization of Nairobi University. Back then, being a student leader at SONU was paramount to joining the struggle for the oppressed against the oppressors. So Titus Tito Ndugosi became SONU's chairman, following in the footsteps of James Orengo and Wanyeri Kihoro. But Tito's entry into activism was about to coincide with the most infamous date in Kenyan history. He was about to be thrust into the deepest end, a depth he'd never swim away from. Stay to find out what happened next. For KOIGI and other activists, MOI's regime was becoming more intolerable. On June 20, 1982, all MPs were coerced to alter the constitution and make Kenya a de jure one-party state. This did not sit well with KOIGI, or Tito, or even the numerous underground movements that were trying to fight the regime. KOIGI was vocal about this, both in parliament and outside parliament, and in most cases, a thorn in the flesh of the ruling class. KOIGI, once undesirable, was now undeniable. The then Attorney General, Charles Jonjo, singled out KOIGI and 6 other backbenchers as the leading rebels. Jonjo called them sissies with beards, or the 7 bearded sisters. To tame him, the ruling party, through Biwott, offered KOIGI to name a price that would make him relinquish the Nakuru North MP seat. KOIGI refused. Moi himself offered KOIGI land and money in order to keep him from criticizing the government. KOIGI refused. But it was Kariuki Chotara who conveyed the displeasure in KOIGI best. In parliament, you refuse to eat. In detention, you refuse to reform. Out of detention, you refuse to keep quiet. We will now crush you like a louse. But what really was KOIGI fighting for? First Kenyatta, now Moi. Was he a rebel without a cause? Or what really was his cause? You will be surprised that his problem was not really KANU, Kenyatta, or even Moi, but the ideological references that these leaders adopted to rule Kenya. Both Kenyatta and Moi were pro-West. They were capitalists. For both leaders, the West was their source of aid, military support, and ideological orientation. The West knew that Africans left on their own after independence would follow the path of nationalism. This was based on the ideas of national determination and self-governance without foreign interference. At the same time, African nationalism was felt to mirror socialism, which was part of the communism that the Soviet Union was advocating. The West had learned this the hard way. They had allowed, or failed to prevent Kwame Nkrumah from rising to power in Ghana in the 1940s and the 1950s. Nkrumah was foremost a nationalist, then a Pan-Africanist. He wanted Africans to unite, not only in the continent, but also even those in diaspora. He was also influential in forming the Organization of African Unity, as well as the Non-Aligned Movement. Nkrumah, however, proclaimed his solidarity with the Soviet Union, support for communism, and Marxist ideologies. He was now hanging out with Che Guevara, a revolutionary, and visiting communist countries like China and socialist states like Vietnam. Then, in 1966, America and other Western countries supported a coup that dethroned Kwame Nkrumah. Shortly after, Ghana realigned itself to the West and even invited the IMF and the World Bank to manage its economy. And that would be the trend in Africa. Leaders with pro-socialist inclinations were ousted or killed. Remember Patrice Lumumba of Zaire? Still, the Cold War was in full effect. And it was no secret that CIA and MI6 agents were being used by the West to remove communist leaders from allied countries. In the world, we have examples. In Iran, 1953, the CIA and the MI6 helped overthrow an elected prime minister in favor of a monarch. The propaganda by the US and the British was that the Iranian prime minister was a communist. But in fact, the British were protecting their oil interests in Iran. They did that in Syria, Guatemala, Ghana, and other places. However, the CIA failed spectacularly when they tried to overthrow Fidel Castro from Cuba in 1961. But leaders who were pro-West, like Mobutu, Kenyatta, MOI, they would thrive. The West advocated for forced democracy. They also advocated for capitalism. Their model of democracy was dictatorship to achieve goals. Its economic model was capitalism, that is, private ownership of resources to make a few people rich. Most politicians prefer this model, as otherwise socialism wouldn't make any politician rich. Hence, the advent of neocolonialism, or what KOIGI called imperialism, a state where the colonial powers continue to rule through the black masters, the involvement of foreign countries in a country's policies. It's no wonder that every time KOIGI was arrested by the police, the first question they asked him was, "Are you a communist?" And at this juncture, I must mention the enigma in the room. The man who suffered detention as much as KOIGI, the man of the unbreakable spirit, the man, the myth, and the legend, Raila Amolo Odinga. Now, remember, Raila had studied in East Germany, the entry to the communist states. Raila's father had dealings with Russia. First a visit in 1964, and then a hospital built by the Russians in Kisumu. And Raila would go on to name his son Fidel Castro, as after one of the heroes of, I'd say, successful communism. Maybe the myth that is Raila could be demystified with the simple explanation that he was pro-communist, hence an enemy of the state, like KOIGI. The government hence viewed these ideas, as valid as they were, to be radical. It was deemed that these ideas should not spread to the masses. Anyone who talked, read books, or even spoke about communist inclinations had to be stopped. Hence the police harassments, the detentions, the assassinations, and the exiles. Intellectual discourses in spaces of learning, like at the University of Nairobi, were banned. Yet, you must let me wonder a little in my mind. What if really KOIGI or another revolutionary became president through the coup in 1982 or through a revolution in, let's say, 1990? Would he, KOIGI, implement equality on resources? Would he nationalize private companies? Would he favor the East, that is communism, or work with the West, that is capitalism? Would he have become a beloved leader, or would the trappings of power corrupt him? And if indeed he became a good nationalist, would the West even allow it? How long before we experience a CIA-instigated coup? Because, as it seems, it is the West-sponsored kind of democracy that all these revolutionaries were against. Ngugi wa Thiong'o had already identified this. He dedicated this version of the Lord's Prayer to the government that was in bed with the West. Our Father in Europe and America, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done in our wealthy Africa, our willing and welcoming Africa, as it was done in the colonial past. Give us this day our daily aid, and forgive us our failures. Help us triumph those who challenge your rule on us, and give us more grace and more aid, and the power to be meek and grateful. Forever and ever. Amen.